Trauma Therapist Podcast Plus listeners can listen to episodes early and ad-free right now. Become a Plus listener by going to Apple Podcasts, searching for the Trauma Therapist Podcast, and signing up today. Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast, a show about the incredible people dedicated to helping those who have experienced trauma. My name is Guy McPherson, and my mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to inspire each of us to help those around us. You ready?
Yes.
All right, so here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. I'm very excited to have as my guest today, Resh Joseph. Reshi, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Guy. Thank you.
You're welcome. So Resh is the clinical director of Highlands Recovery, and he specializes in the treatment of complex psychological trauma, PTSD, addictions, and other trauma-related disorders. Resh commenced his career as a doctor in the UK, ceased practicing medicine in 2005, and then fully retrained as a counseling psychotherapist, obtaining a master's in psychology and the Neuroscience of Mental Health from the prestigious King's College in London. For the past 15 years, he's practiced exclusively as a psychological professional working in Singapore, Indonesia, Switzerland, and now Australia. His trauma-related work experience includes working with the criminal justice system in Singapore as part of the prison psychiatric team, treating individuals with a wide range of serious psychiatric illnesses and severe personality and behavioral disorders. Resh, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get going here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
So I'm originally from Singapore. That's where I was born. That's where I grew up. And when I was in my late teens, mid-teens, I went to England. I finished school in England and then went to university and lived in England for 2.5 decades, and eventually moved back to Asia, moved back to Singapore. And by that point, I had left medicine and begun to retrain as a psychologist, a counseling professional. I, through my own journey, had come to realize that there was a lot more to be done in this area. Became fascinated by it, became fascinated by the science of the brain and the science of human suffering. And at that time, there was the beginnings of what we now know as the trauma movement. We had people like Bessel van der Kolk and Judith Herman and Gabor Mate were really starting to come to prominence in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. And the work that they did really struck a chord with me. And I wanted to know a lot more about what they did and why it was so relevant to where we are today. And so I moved back to Asia and lived in Asia, sometimes in Singapore. I spent some time in Thailand. I spent 7 years in Bali, in Indonesia, moved around Asia. And then earlier this year, got a call from an old friend and colleague of mine who was part of this organization called Highlands Recovery. And they contacted me because they wanted to move into the addiction space, but they wanted to do it in a radically different way. They wanted to approach it from the trauma angle, which is what I'm all about. And earlier this year, that was presented to me, and I thought that it seemed like a very good opportunity to expand what I was doing and to carry it forward here in the Southern Highlands in Australia. And the Southern Highlands in Australia is where I sit currently as clinical director of this wonderful organization.
So you brought up a lot of elements there. Fascinating background to have moved from medicine to psychotherapy. Why the shift?
Variety of reasons. But I suppose broadly, I mean, I rely on great writers like M. Scott Peck and Henri Nguyen for this. Most of us who are attracted to this line of work are attracted to it for very personal reasons. As Henri Nguyen said in his wonderful book, The Wounded Healer, the person that the psychologist is trying to heal is really himself. And there's a lot of truth to that for me. I was attracted to this sector of the mental health industry through my own personal struggles, but also, and this is no slight on the profession as a whole, my father is a surgeon, my brother is a doctor, so I have no personal animosity towards medicine in general, but I just found that for me, medicine was not the answer. I eventually came to, I suppose you'd call it a crisis of faith. I couldn't continue really to work in an industry I'd lost faith in. The pharmaceutical industry has its place. Medicines have their place. They are part and parcel of the fantastic advances that we've had over humankind. But I felt certainly for me, they were terribly lacking. And I was really searching for answers to why I and so many like me were suffering and why medicine seemed to have no answers. And if medicine didn't have any answers, then where are those answers? Well, why are so many people suffering and the drugs so ineffective? Why are so many people depressed? Why are rates of anxiety going through the roof? Why is it that people are now being crippled by a whole alphabet soup of mental health disorders, ASD, ADHD, a whole variety of things? Was there an answer? And in the study of trauma, in the subject of trauma, I found many of those answers.
So this, as you call it, crisis of faith, you were experiencing while you were practicing physician?
No, I wasn't practicing at the time. I'd already left. I just
Okay.
didn't really know. Yeah, I didn't really know what I was going to do with myself. It was assumed both by myself and by members of my family and by most people that eventually I would just go back to it. But it was my good fortune that I discovered the writings of Alice Miller to begin with. And then from her, the world of trauma opened up to me. Once I discovered that world, there really was no going back.
What was it about the trauma, the writings of trauma, then the understanding of that spoke with you, that kind of seemed to inspire you? What was it about that?
Well, to begin with, it began to provide me with a coherent answer as to why many of the experiences that I had, the personal experiences that I had began to make sense. I'd hitherto regarded myself as someone either very flawed or mad or both, insane, uh, mad, bad, all of those things. Suddenly I chanced upon an explanation that was quite radical in that, no, you're not mad. You're certainly not bad. There is a way to understand and explain why you are the way you are. And so that was the beginnings of the personal journey. And of course, as I began to study the subject more closely, both on a personal level and then eventually going to university and studying it there when I went back to retrain, it was something that simply struck a chord. It really resonated with me. It explained things on the macro level, the societal level, the personal level, the family level. It suddenly, many of the things that just puzzled me, that just seemed inexplicable to me, began to make sense. And increasingly, as I've gone deeper and deeper into the subject, both in a personal way as well as in a professional way, so much of what ails the world today, when viewed through this lens, can be understood really quite simply from the terrible global conflicts that we observe to the much smaller personal, familial, societal, community conflicts that just continue to plague us as a species. I find that when I view it through this particular lens, the lens of trauma, there's nothing particularly mystifying about it. The language, the science, the understanding to explain what is otherwise intractable and inexplicable human behavior is there. It is there.
Oh, you talked about the work you're doing now at Highlands Recovery. Before we get to that, so once you started retraining, what were your thoughts? What were your goals in a sense? Were you like, okay, this is the field I want to work in? I want to help people who have experienced trauma. What was it for you?
We're going back some years now. I suppose it would have been to begin with. I just wanted, um, like a hungry person that's encountered a feast. I just wanted to consume as much of this as I could. It was a subject that endlessly fascinated me and continues to fascinate me. I continue to live in this world. I just love everything about it, and it was something that I took to so readily and consumed me so greatly that it to begin with was just personal consumption. I wanted to read everything on the subject. I wanted to know everything. I wanted to know every facet of this. I wanted to understand it. I just found the thing. And as many people will know, when you find that thing that captures you, um, you just enter this twilight zone of the senses where nothing else really exists. It's all you think about, all you talk about. And I certainly began my journey into this subject in that way. The desire to help people, the desire to translate that knowledge, that information into a practical way of making a living and constructing a program and being a therapist, all of that came much, much later. To begin with, it was just an all-consuming passion and fascination with the subject and what was being written, what was being researched, what we were finding out, the tantalizing discoveries that were being made by very important men and women in the early 2000s and late 1990s and early 2000s. Some very, very important books in this sphere were written. And also I could not help getting over the feeling that I was on the cusp of a wave, that this massive wave had broken over the world, and that I was on the leading cusp of it, and that it was a really tantalizing time for us as a species almost, that this information was now going to be widespread. I hear it all the time when I work with people here, when I work with people globally, when I work with people in whichever sphere I do. And I tell them what it is I've learned. I explain to them their symptoms, and I help them craft a recovery program based on an understanding of their trauma. They're just stunned. They're just shocked that there is such a simple way in which to understand their own suffering and how it explains almost everything about them. And that's a delight that I never get over, even now. That it's yeah, that would be the passion, I'd say. That would be the passion.
For many people, it removes a lot of shame, right? You talked about thinking yourself, maybe I was a bad person, maybe I was a mad person.
Mm.
Certainly that's the case, I think, with addiction. So when you're working now in the context of Highlands Recovery, how did this come about? You said you were asked to kind of do things a little bit differently, or they were going to start doing things differently. Bring us there. What was that discussion like? What were they talking about?
So the CEO of the company, Cameron Francis, is an old friend and colleague of mine. I've known him over a decade. This is going back to when he worked in Singapore and I was there at the time. And even back then in the early 2010s, already, I think, I'm not really sure how I struck him, but I must have struck him as different because I was perhaps one of the few people attached to this industry who was viewing the whole addiction and alcoholism matrix through the trauma lens. And I think at the time there weren't many people like me. Now, I think that must have struck a chord with him, because when he was approached to head this organization, one of the people he thought of getting as a clinical director was me. And I think what we both have is a shared passion for the subject. Me from a clinical perspective, and him from a different one. He's not a clinical person, but I think his passion for trauma is equally as great as mine. And he's Australian, so he knows this market, he knows this area, he knows this country far better than I do. I've never lived here. I didn't move here till some months ago. This was it's never on my radar. But he must have known something, because when I moved here, there is no one who is approaching the subject of alcoholism or alcohol use disorder and the various other addictions that afflict so many people here. No one seems to be approaching it from the trauma perspective, which really rather staggered me, because I always considered Australia, I've met many Australian clinicians over the years. They've always been of the highest order. They're all fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
They're all very skilled, very knowledgeable. So I was just flabbergasted that no one here was approaching addiction from that angle, which just seemed to me so obvious. And
Resh, let me interject here for a second. What angle or angles were they, approaching it from? And in turn, what are the other angles that addiction can be looked at?
Well, there are four possible angles at which you can come. There are four possible answers. And the trouble is that none of these answers are absolutely correct, but none of them are absolutely wrong either. The first one is, you can say it's just bad behavior, the criminal justice model. Addicts, alcoholics, they're badly behaved, you punish them sufficiently and you'll correct them. I think no serious person thinks in this way any longer. There are still people who do, but no serious person thinks this. I mean, it does, for one thing, it doesn't explain why. Why do many intelligent people behave in such fantastically stupid way? No serious person does this. So there is value in it, because yes, you have people who do some spectacularly bad things. So that's one. The second one, which I see the vestiges of in this country and certainly in many others, broadly called the disease model, the medical model, which is you have an inherited illness. It's how you were born. You have a disease, if you like. That disease causes you to do these terrible, spectacularly stupid things. So that's that. That seems to be the predominant model here. The trouble with that model is that if that is true, if it's a disease, then you just stop consuming the alcohol, and that's the problem solved. In the same way that if you're a diabetic, you stop eating sugar, problem solved. There's an end to it. But as most people in the recovery game will tell you, stopping the alcohol is not where your problems end. It's where your problems begin. You haven't addressed the reasons why you started drinking in that way in the first place, why you drink in a way that is so different to others, why you can't stop when the negative consequences are beginning to stack up. The wife is about to leave and take the 3 kids. The boss is about to fire you, and all those things are about to happen, and yet you cannot stop. You're now sitting in front of a judge on a DUI charge, and you still can't stop. You haven't explained any of that. The disease model does not explain that. It's lacking. And what seems to happen here is that we try and fix this in a pharmacological way, which can work. I don't say it can't. What it cannot tell you is it cannot tell you why. It can't tell you why you started down this road in the first place. So that's your second. The third is the trauma model, which views addiction purely as a psychological, as a result of psychological injury, which is what trauma is. And that at least makes an attempt to explain to you why you drink or consume substances in the way that you do. I think it's also flawed in that it ignores the undeniable biological aspect to addiction, which is, all the dopamine systems in the brain are compromised. There is definitely a medical component to it. And then the final way of answering this, which is the way that I think is the best answer, imperfect though it is what is now called the biopsychosocial answer, started in 1977 by an American psychiatrist called George Engel. It says addiction is part biological, medical, part psychological, but also part social. So it tries to cover all of these bases. The weakness of this argument is that it's a bit like grandma's nightshirt, it tries to cover everything.
So thank you for that explanation.
Sorry, that was a slightly crude joke. I apologize.
No. Uh, what percentage of people who experience addiction have experienced trauma?
I can speak both anecdotally and statistically. In terms of statistics, it's very, very varied, but certainly a very, very high percentage of them do. From a purely professional, anecdotal perspective, in terms of the people that I've come across, I've never met a person who would qualify for alcohol use disorder, a severe alcohol use disorder, or a severe substance use disorder, which is what we call addictions today. I've never met anyone who would qualify for that diagnosis who doesn't have some kind of trauma or stress-related disorder. They all have it. If I look hard enough, I'll find the stressor in their childhood, in their work, in their marriage, in some kind of abuse somewhere that kickstarted the whole thing. So the two, in my view, are, when you talk about one, you're really talking about the other. You can't talk about one without talking about the other.
Right. And I think it was Gabor Mate, certainly, who's famously said, if you see, where you see addiction, you see trauma. There's kind of unequivocal. So what does this mean now as you come to work here at Highlands Recovery? With what you just said, how do you integrate this into the practice, the training, the treatment that you provide there?
It's a very radical shift. For starters, as I previously said, the perspective of you have an illness, you just need to stop drinking doesn't cut the mustard. Where in other places, perhaps people are told, when you stop drinking, therein your problems end. I say to people, when you stop drinking, that's when your problems begin. All of the problems or the trauma that you're drinking. So it's really the first question, right? Alcohol in many ways is not the problem. If you look at the disease model, alcohol or alcohol consumption or substance use, that's the problem. You stop that, you solve the problem. My view is that alcohol consumption, substance consumption is the solution to a problem, or at least an attempt to provide yourself with a solution. If you view it that way, then you will immediately see that the second question you ask is, if the alcohol is an attempt to solve a problem, what is the problem that the alcohol was trying to solve? That's the question that I'm trying to answer here. Your alcohol use, your substance use, your pornography use, your gambling, whatever you'd like to call it, that is your attempt to solve a problem. And if that is so, what problem are you trying to solve? I think it's worth your while finding out. And that's what we do here. It seems a very, very simple, small difference, but it's not. It's a radical departure. It's a world of difference. And I found, certainly working here as I did before I came here, when presented to people in that way, it really does strike a chord.
So give us a specifics. What might that look like? How might someone answer that question?
Um, in a variety of ways. So if they are encouraged to look at their alcohol consumption, the vast majority of the people I work with here have, a severe alcohol use disorder. So alcohol is the drug of choice, right? And so what very often they discover is that the reason they're in this place has very little, if anything, to do with the alcohol. The alcohol part of it is reasonably easily solved. You go through a detox process. Once that detox process is completed, you've gone through it, the alcohol is out of your system, you've been medically stabilized. That's the alcohol part of it solved. But then they are faced with a question by me and by my staff here. Why did you go down this path in the first place? That alcohol was there to solve something. And that is where people really discover very confronting and uncomfortable truths about themselves. They are forced to reanalyze and to um, reassess relationships that they've had, jobs that they've been in, sometimes the childhood they lived through, and they're forced in many ways to take off the rose tinted glasses that maybe the lives that they led were not as perfect as they had hitherto thought. That really living a luxurious life or a wealthy life, in a very nicely appointed property on the beachfront, it, that is not a vaccinate. Wealth is not a vaccination against trauma, as I like to tell the people here. And that when they really begin to look at their lives, they realize how the little things or what they thought of as the little things that have happened to them have all stacked up and have combined into causing enough of a psychological injury that then necessitated um, the use of the alcohol in the way that they have used, if
What are
that makes
some,
sense.
yeah, it does. Appreciate that. What are some of the ways, given all the different modalities out there readily available to work in this kind of context, what has been your training in terms of trauma treatment modalities, and which ones are you integrating into this program?
So the perspective that I work from is the one adumbrated by Judith Herman in 1991. She did, as well as Van der Kolk, Joseph Spinazzola, and Julian Ford in a very famous landmark paper in 1991. And it essentially says that effective treatment of trauma comes in three stages. Stage one, which is in many ways what we do here, is referred to as stabilization. This is present focus, it's skills based. It essentially says to the person, whatever your traumas are, the net result of that is that it has made your life very unstable. If I'm drinking half a bottle of vodka a day, my life is not very stable. If
Mhm.
I'm, gambling, drinking, pornography, drug use, if I'm doing all of these things, then my life has become incredibly unstable. But even for those without these addictive behaviors, you can see there is a tremendous amount of instability. They can't manage their anxiety. They have panic attacks. They have intrusive recollecting. They have flashbacks. They have nightmares. They have massive avoidance behaviors. They have a whole constellation of symptoms that make their lives effectively unmanageable or unstable. So the first port of call, first phase is how do we stabilize our lives? How do we help you to stabilize your life? And this is entirely skills based. Part of it is cognitive, part of it is based on somatic psychology, some of it is behavioral, some of it is environmental. But there's a whole construct of skills that people learn to be able to self soothe and self stabilize. And that has to happen before anything else. Once the person has done that, then they can consider moving on to phase two, which Herman referred to as the reprocessing phase. This is, in contrast, past focus and non skills based. This is where you begin to ask questions like, what is it that happened to me in the past that is the result of why I'm here. And the reprocessing can be done using EMDR, which is my favorite way, but there are many different ways in which this can be done. One of the great joys of working in a place like this is I have access to people who can reprocess trauma in a variety of marvelous, marvelous ways. I've got someone here who's trained to use a system called IFS, Internal Family Systems, created by Richard Schwartz. Fantastic way to reprocess trauma. Psychodrama, fantastic way. EMDR, fantastic way. CPT, Patricia Resnick, fantastic. There are many, many fantastic ways, but they all have the same end goal, which is reciprocal inhibition, which is to reduce and eliminate the distress that traumatic memory has on the individual. And that's your phase 2. And then there's phase 3, which is not a lot of people enter, but I always find it's a good thing when people do it, which is about the future. What are my relationships going to look like moving forward? If I know what I don't want them to look like, if I know what they look like when they damage me, then what do the healthy ones look like? And it's really about building a future that is both meaningful and purposeful in the context of someone suffering. That's, I think, a very, very overlooked and important phase, because unless we do that, then in many ways, my personal suffering is meaningless. Mm-hmm. What's the reason for it? There isn't one. And so it's the ability to extract meaning from what happened to me or what happened to us. That is also a key part of it. And I just thought that Judith Herman, explained this and laid it out so beautifully in her book, 1991 book, Trauma and Recovery. And that's the perspective I work from.
You can hear the excitement in your voice, and the hope. I mean, I could just imagine the hope that this presents for a lot of people who are suffering, who do find themselves addicted, and again, the shame that comes with that, and the feeling of being confined and restricted. But you're presenting what appears to me, it seems to me, a very hopeful kind of plate in a sense. We can get through this.
Our hope is a key ingredient in this whole process. It's also why this process is so powerful when it's done in communities such as this one, because so many people who come here have lost hope. Mm-hmm. They do not think they can recover. They do not think it's possible to retrieve and recover and live healthy, fulfilling, meaningful lives. And it's the ability to see others who are on the same journey, who are a little further along the road less traveled, as M. Scott Peck put it. It's the ability to see that translates into hope. And hope is, it's like a superpower. It's the quintessential human attribute, right? It can be simultaneously our greatest strength if we have it, but it can be a terrible weakness when it's not there. And so you're absolutely right to talk about hope in this way. So important.
As we kind of wind down here, I want to kind of open up another topic here, but I realize it's a big one. But countering that hope is I think is a common understanding in this field that there's a recidivism, right? It takes many times for people to go oftentimes many times to go through recovery before it, quote unquote, sticks. Speak to that a bit.
The two people I think who answered this question best were James Prochaska and Carlo Di Clementi in 1981, when it's a very, very long name for a very simple theory. They called it the trans-theoretical model of the stages of change. Really, what this model says is that every person who embarks on a journey here goes through 6 different stages. They go through a stage where they do not think they have a problem, and then they come to realize that they do, and then they are fully convinced that they do, and then they enact the change, and then they grow, and then they take a step back. But that's part and parcel of this transtheoretical model, because there are times where people have to find out what doesn't work as well as what does work. To put it very, very simplistically, is it possible for me as a recovering alcoholic to live over a bar? In some cases, I might need to find out the answer to that in an uncomfortable way. That is not the same as saying that I failed. And so that's a very important view that I try to translate to people here. It's not picking up the drink that damages people. If that person happens to pick up a drink, but they contact us or they contact an organization to get back onto the wagon in 2 weeks, well, that's a very different conversation to the person who gets back on the wagon after 2 years. It's the 2 years of being out there in the wilderness, if you like. It's the time that really can cause someone to damage. Very, very difficult for a person to burn their life to the ground in 2 days. So my message to people out there, as well as to people here, is the same. This is part of your recovery process. Take the shame out of it. We are trying to build, trauma resilience and stress resilient systems. They're not always going to work. Sometimes we need to learn what doesn't. Get back on the wagon. Just get back on it.
Appreciate that, Resh. All right. So how do people learn more about what you're doing and Highlands Recovery? What's the best way for them to reach you?
They can look at our website, which is highlandsrecovery.com.au. Everything that we're doing is on there. There are many, many videos of myself. There are excerpts of podcasts with excellent people like yourself on there, where I explain the program in much detail. And there are ways in which to contact us directly. And anyone who contacts us, I'd be very happy to speak with them. And of course, they can listen to podcasts such as this one.
Awesome. Resh, thanks so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me on, guys. It's been a real pleasure to talk about a subject that I can talk about all day, every day.
Yeah, I appreciate it. All right, we'll be in touch. Take care.
Thank you.